Does this thing work?
Yeah, it's working now.
Okay. I don't want to blow y'all out. This morning, we're talking about Jacob. I think I waited a little bit too long to sign up, so I don't feel like Jacob is probably my cream of the crop choice of what I would like to choose. We did Joseph in the high school class last week, and it was like, it was easy, but in a good way. And they set the bar pretty high as far as class activity and participation. So y'all better make sure that the high schoolers don't outdo y'all. All right? All of you. So y'all, last couple of weeks we've been through the Abraham, Isaac, and then the third in that line is Jacob, right? Oh, y'all didn't? Somebody did a good job of counting. Well, I didn't look at the list. I just assumed Abraham was, since Isaac was last week, I assumed Abraham was before that, but whatever, that's fine. We can still do our lesson, fortunately. So, there are going to be, we're not going to read, I mean, there's no way we can read all there is to read about Jacob like there was Melchizedek, where you could read everything in a very short amount of time. So I've got it kind of broken down into some different, I'm going to call them sections or whatever. I guess is the best way to word it. Starting at Jacob's birth, I'm probably going to go back and forth between Isaac and Jacob, but I mean Jacob usually when I say it. If you ever are wondering, just ask me to clarify. So first, we're going to look at his birth, and that's going to be in Genesis 25. So Genesis 25 will be the beginning of our Genesis text. We'll go several chapters past that at some point. And just so you know, my PowerPoint is just going to have the topic lines. I don't have a super in-depth PowerPoint. If you want me to repeat something, verse or whatever, just ask me. I'm just not real big on PowerPoint, and I just wanted to have the points up there to keep us all in line, including myself. So Genesis 25. So let's start in verse 21, and what I want to do is I want to read 21 through 26, and I'm going to ask for a volunteer for that. While we're reading, I want you to think about some things that you see in this text that will be at that foreshadowing of Christ directly. Not everything today will be a direct foreshadowing of Christ, but it'll kind of have some parallels, I'll call it. But there are some things that, as I was reading it, these weren't even in my study guide. It was just something that I kind of drew out and was like, hey, I think this is even more relevant than what the study guide talks about concerning his birth. So somebody read Genesis 25, 21 through 26 for us. Okay. What, anybody see anything in there that they can kind of relate to thinking about Jesus' situation, Christ's situation when he was born, the situation he was born into? Yes, ma'am. You better not be cheating. Okay. Okay. Good. Um, so the older serving the younger, at this point in time, how would that have been viewed by the the people? What I said, the older serving the younger, the younger serving, the older serving the younger. How would that have been viewed by we? It would have been viewed like that'd been like, whoa, taboo, opposite of what anybody would expect.
Like
And
Jacob later on crossed his hands to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, and Joseph like, whoa, 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 you're not supposed to do that. And Jacob's like, I got it, you know. But that was not a great deal.
right, and with Christ, we we know he was what what did the Israelites expect of their Savior, of the Messiah? They expected a conquering king. They expected somebody from a deliverer, and they were expecting a royal, some kind of, not necessarily a, I'm not, I mean they did expect a royal bloodline, but they expected that person to come forward as to be a leader, to be, and it be like very clear this is the person, right? And yet, right, right, correct. So in the same way that the people in when Jacob was born, that younger serving the older, I mean older serving the younger. See, I told y'all I'm gonna get stuff backwards the whole time. It's just completely opposite of what they would expect at that time. Yeah, it's against the tradition that they have in their mind and their people. All right, what else in that birth scene would you um, okay? Right. Um, Anybody see anything else?
Well, just to add to his, it's kind of a big deal whenever God speaks to a woman in the scripture. Like it really is a big deal. Like you don't see that hardly ever
Right.
throughout. Usually he's speaking to the patriarch, not the matriarch. It's usually the patriarch.
And especially by the time he made it to Mary, by the time Mary was
Yeah.
around, there was at least a few examples of that.
Yeah.
But at the time of Rebecca, there was none. That was
Yeah.
right. Well, I'm not gonna say none,
You
but
might
there was
say Sarah was one kind of indirectly, but because it's kind of a mystery as to who exactly like the third person is that comes to like
right.
people disagree as to who is that comes to Sarah and she laughs, but you know some people would say with Jesus, angel of the Lord, whatever. But, yeah.
Um, all right, let's flip over and read that Matthew text because there's two or three other things that I want to point out, but let's read the Matthew text and see if any more come to light after we've read this Genesis text. So Matthew chapter 1 and 18. So somebody read 18 through 25. Matthew 1, 18 through 25. All right. After hearing that, does anybody see any additional things that kind of pop out at them as how they can those two relate, parallel? There's one more thing two more things for sure that I want to make sure get pointed out. Were either Rebecca or Mary supposed to be able to have children? No. I mean, Mary by age, yes, but we know that she was a virgin. We know that that was a miraculous thing. Rebecca, same way. So both of them it was that divine. That's right. It was. Correct. That's right. That is right. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that is correct. And both of those things happened so that God's plan could be fulfilled. All right. The one other thing that we had, that was one of the things, by the way, Chris. So good job. Both of these individuals, their birth was foretold. It was foretold by, I'm not going to call Jacob's a prophecy per se, but it was foretold that, hey, you are going to have, we read it there, you have two nations in your womb. You're going to have a child. So that foretelling about that, and we alluded to it earlier in Michael's point a little bit, but both of these individuals were leaders of their nation in each their respective way, right? Jacob, I mean, we read he was going to be the leader of a nation, two nations there, Jacob and Esau. And then yet we've got Christ, and he's going to be the leader of the church, leader of that nation in a spiritual sense. And it specifically says, let's see, I don't remember if that was Matthew. Yep, Matthew in chapter 1, verses 21. She will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So, showing his leadership, he will save his people from their sins, and being that spiritual nation that he's going to lead. Okay. Anything else? Anybody got anything else on the birth? That's all that I've really got down. So moving on to the next thing that comes up is the birthright. So back in Genesis 26, we know the story probably pretty well about Jacob and Esau and the birthright situation. Who has the birthright who has the birthright in general of, especially we're talking about Jewish Old Testament culture? Firstborn male. So, who was the firstborn male of Jacob and Esau? Esau. And when he was born, we read about Jacob holding on to his foot, so he was behind Esau. And so, how does this occur with Esau handing his birthright over to Jacob? Does anybody remember? Yeah, and this is where, for me, Jacob, and I've studied it, and I know people have talked about it over the years, but like, to me, the deceptive part of Jacob, that's probably one of the parts I struggle with him the most. That's why my comments earlier about I waited too long, because that's who I got stuck with. But in this, it says, he comes in it's his brother, right? And he's like, he could have just given him the food, but he says, "Sell me your birthright. Like, I'll trade you." And sometimes people talk about it that it's stolen. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but the birthright came to Jacob via Esau, whereas, kind of in a contrast, this is a parallel, not necessarily foreshadowing, but parallel situation. What about Christ's birthright? Has anybody ever thought about that? How Christ's birthright would compare to that? Anything? So, if we flip over to Colossians 1. So, that's what, let's read here in Colossians 1:15. So he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So, to your point, Lauren, like, that's what we're talking about as far as him being the firstborn of God initially. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. So, it is important that he was the firstborn of God, but that's more important that he was in firstborn of the dead, because that's what established that overcoming death and being able, that was the point, I think, that the lesson was trying to bring out. What I was reading is, we share in that birthright with him because he chose to be the firstborn of the dead. Does that make sense? Everybody, Tim's nodding with his eyes shut. I'm really got him going. That one, that's probably the one I have the least amount of notes on my paper on, because it was in the study guide, but I didn't really see it as strong of a correlation. Next, so you want to read that for us, Michael? That's that's a good add-on verse too. That part about the birthright. Um, I mean, I don't have anything else to add to that. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. I hadn't thought about that. That correct. One 100% agree. 100% agree. Um, but that is man's influence into trying to push it. No different than Sarah, Abraham and Sarah with um, Ishmael. I mean, right. Right. Um, yeah, I agree with that 100%. So next on our list is bride. Um, so in Genesis 29 is where we find Jacob's courting situations, plural. Um, how, and this is something that we're probably again all pretty familiar with. How many years did uh, Jacob agree to serve Laban for Rachel? 7 years. And then what happened? He, he got duped. That's right. The great deceiver was deceived. And because of that, he went on to do what? 7 more. So for let's make sure I get the name right. For Jacob, his bride was very important, right? He had his eyes set on um, Rachel. He got duped, ended up with Leah and then Rachel. Um, but that's a long time to to serve somebody for, uh, and knowing that you've got to sit here and do it all over again after you didn't get what you really thought you were getting. Um, so his bride was really important. Uh, what do we know is Christ's bride? The church. Not a trick question. The church. Um, and he gave his life up for his bride. Um, in studying, I never really thought this part of it, but most of the references about the bride, if not all of them, about the bride being the church was all after his death and resurrection, right? Because the church didn't exist before. I thought there may have been some like foreshadowing prophecy type stuff, but I couldn't really find any in the New Testament about that. But you got like Ephesians, you got the chapter on husbands and wives that talks about Christ and how shows how important the bride, the wife, the bride is to him. And you've got a lot of, also in Revelation, you've got a lot of references to them, to the bride, the church, those things. So just, that's a quick, the bride was important to both Jacob and Christ. All right, anybody got anything else before I move on that, on bride, wife situation? Yes, sir.
Well, it's not, it's kind of in relation to the bride thing. Like, we've talked about how Jesus wasn't what they expected, but he did become kind of what they expected in a spiritual sense. Like, he was the conquering king.
Correct.
He was like, he did deliver them from oppression, but it was a different route, a different way than what they thought. And Jacob, he's this mild man dwelling in tents. He does become this rugged outdoorsman type person. Like, he does become that. Like, being a shepherd and working for Laban, like, you had to be tough and you do that. I mean, that's hard job. So he does become kind of this rugged outdoorsman type person, becomes this really manly figure. But he does it for his bride, for his wife.
Yeah,
His bride.
that's a good point.
I don't know if that makes sense or ties into anything we're talking about, but that's just all I had.
So next would be the number 12. Does anybody know kind of what number 12 symbolism behind number 12, what that means in thinking about it in a biblical, spiritual way? So probably the best way that I found to put it was that was the symbolism for perfect authority. Is kind of what it. So we know Jacob had how many sons? 12, which became the 12 what? Tribes, which eventually led to. Elaborate. Hold on. It's true. Rachel first. Yeah, I I would tend to agree with that. I wasn't thinking, I didn't process that coming into this morning, but I would agree with that. But he had 12 sons, and there was 12 tribes. The 12 part being the complete, the completeness. When you go over to the New Testament side and think about Christ, he had how many apostles? And when one of them was lost because of his own selfish desires, there was 11. And what happened? We had to we had to cast lots to get back to 12. So to try to keep that complete, ended up being 13. I hadn't thought about that
The way
part.
it's counted, if you look at like Revelation and the 12 tribes, the way it's counted, I think it's that, no, no, it's not Revelation. It's Levi in the Old Testament wasn't considered like a tribe, like have territory, a
Correct.
tribal territory. Like he was just spread out. He was kind of like the amalgamation of all of the tribes. He was like the Israel was God's chosen people. Levi is his chosen priesthood.
Yeah.
So you would have Levi would be counted, and then Ephraim and Manasseh would be counted. But you could count Levi, and that would be 13.
Sure.
So it's kind of
Okay. I hadn't thought about that part. But that's a good point. Um,
yeah.
so Revelations, there's a ton of 12s to both of y'all's points. 12 thrones, 12 gates, 12 angels at the gates. All the 12s. Even in the Old Testament, you think about 12 then, besides the 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes, all that. Back in Numbers, you've got the 12 of each animal sacrifice for the different sacrifices. You had the 12 stones in the breastplate of Aaron when they were, God was giving them those instructions in Exodus. I mean, it shows, when you start looking, it shows up way more than we could talk about today. But that is definitely a correlation there. The next one, we've still got, I think we're going to be able to get finished with what I've got here. The next one is angels. So this is one, quite honestly, that when I read it in the study guide, I was like, I don't know wording wise if I want to go with all this. So, but Genesis 32, we'll flip over there to Genesis 32. And at the end of Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32, is when Jacob is going to meet Esau, and he sends everybody across the river, and he's the only one left on that side of the river. And what happens that night? So he wrestles with a man, and the study guide said he struggled with angels. I don't really know. I mean, we can all read this section and see what it says. But he did have this interaction with a I'm not gonna say divine, because it wasn't. Would you wouldn't consider an angel divine? Somebody help me out here.
Well, if it's the angel of the Lord, this is the thing. I think the angel of the Lord was a very powerful angel. Like, he could represent God and be said to be God. And we find that in several places of the Old Testament. Some people think that's Jesus, and that kind of explains that in another way. But yeah, there was an angel here, more than likely an angel, speaking on behalf of God here. Probably the way I would have it, as if he were. It was as good as God speaking to him.
Right.
That's kind of how I would.
And I would agree. Like, to me, you've got this interaction that's a heavenly interaction. I mean, and how many people how many people that walked the face of this earth had heavenly interactions like this? Very, very few. And so he had this heavenly interaction, and yes, sir. So I hadn't thought about it in that exact sense, Mr. Chuck. That is very true. Um, that was the part that I was going to bring up next is that the angel, while Christ was on earth, those angels ministered to him both in that case as well as one other case. Does anybody know in the other case when the angels ministered to him, strengthened him? In the garden. That is correct. In the garden. Um, correct. Yes, sir. I was thinking about that section of verses, and I didn't think to try to find it, but that is what I was thinking. I was thinking about that through this. Um, gotcha. Um, yeah. So it's the one thing we do know what the text says about when Jacob struggled with the man. What does he say? What does Jacob say at the end of that? I've seen God face to face, and he has spared my life. And I mean, that's what it says. And that would be something that's very unique to probably one of the strongest correlations I could say between Christ and Jacob, because there's, well, I was just going to say, there's nobody else that's seen the face of God. I mean, that's what the text says. I don't know that I can't say he did, can't say he didn't. That's just what the text says. Correct. Correct. And he said that's when you'll be called. Now you'll be called Israel, and then walk with a limp the rest of your life. Right. I actually did think about that when I was reading. I'm glad you brought that up though, because yeah, I thought the same exact thing when I read it. It's like you're sitting here wrestling with the man, God, who, whatever the case is, and you're making demands of him, and then you win, and you get blessed. It's very, very interesting. Um, that's right.
John,
Yes, sir.
I was going to leave the angels here. I have one more thing on
Okay. Yeah, come on.
Because that, like Jim pointed out, there's more than one time that we see Jacob's kind of this weird character. He sees angels everywhere. Like he's seen angels at least 4 times in his life. Like I think there's the when it comes to there's two other places besides this and the latter scene where he encounters angels. So it's like this is what he does. He goes places and he sees angels. It's like he's not the most moral of people, yet he has these strange encounters. And the very first one that he had is this ladder that reaches to heaven. And I think that in itself is kind of this way to God. It's like this way,
I didn't thought about that. They're going up and down, and
I've
yeah.
often kind of wondered if that was kind of a foreshadowing of Christ in himself. Like,
I hadn't thought about it that way. So, see, y'all are doing pretty good. The high school class may still be edging you out a little bit, but y'all are doing good.
they don't have to have coffee to have energy.
Have you taught the high school class on Sunday morning? It's like you can tell which one of them had an energy drink and which one hadn't. I'm not going to hit our last point, but there was one other thing that I thought was interesting. This is not not on the comparison. This is more on just the Jacob side. When I had never noticed this, Jacob, who did Jacob marry, and what was their relation to him? First cousins, right? He married his. So he married his uncle's daughter, his first cousin. Right after, in the section right after that, it's not something that I don't even know if I've ever studied or read. Does anybody know who Esau married?
Yeah, I was just looking at that. He, when Jacob was sent away, Esau decided that he wanted to spite his parents. So he went over to where Ishmael had settled and married one of Ishmael's daughters, which made him marry his first cousin, or at least half cousin, because she was by another mother. But yeah, just to spite his parents, he went over and married one of these women, as Jacob went and married into the family on the other side. Yeah, carrying on the
That
family tradition.
well, I just thought it was interesting that out of all the people in the world at this point, I don't know how many there were, but it was more than just these 12 people, right, or whatever. And they both married their first cousins on each side, and I just kind of thought, I was like, that's something I hadn't ever picked up on before. And also on that, let me make sure I'm not wrong here. When Esau, there was a number. There was a number associated with the number of Esau's. I don't know. Remember if it was their kids or it was something to do though. There was a 12 associated with Esau.
Oh yeah, from him would be 12 princes.
12 princes. That's right. Yeah.
Can't remember where that is.
So we'll continue on Wednesday night. Appreciate y'all's input.